Footage of a potential upcoming flat-screen game, Unrecord, has been doing the rounds recently, and I think it's something we need to talk about, as I believe this has important things to say about the current state of VR experiences. You can see it playing out behind me now. Visuals that look near indistinguishable from real life, plus phenomenal animation and movement work that further blurs the line between real life and game. Because of how fluidly, freely, and realistic the avatar's actions are, you'd be justified in thinking this were motion-captured movement or that it is a VR game. But according to the developer, it's neither. All of what you're seeing was played using keyboard and mouse, apparently. Taking them on their word, it would seem they've developed some kind of system to make VR-like aiming possible with only mouse input alone, complemented further by all the other visceral details. If all this were true, then it is an outstanding achievement. It's a flat-screen game with animations so convincing and lifelike that it could fool us into believing it was a VR title. And based upon the attention and reception this trailer has received, onlookers are extremely compelled and excited about it. And why wouldn't they be, after all? It's not only the visuals, but the reason all of the details that make this gameplay trailer so compelling is because they're exactly the kind of evolutions which bring us further away from gamey abstractions and closer to our own lived experiences and expectations of real-life behavior. How much the gamey details add to or detract from a game depends on the genre, of course, but we can say with confidence for the modern shooter genre that its goal is to be viscerally ever more closer to real life. But hold on just a minute, something seems to be wrong here. I've said that onlookers are very excited about this game. The attention it's received from the many millions of views it's gotten in such a short amount of time since its reveal would certainly indicate there is a lot of interest for this kind of experience. But if entrenched conventional wisdom for game design that we all lean on so hard is to be trusted, players should not be so interested in how it appears to play. For one, the camera is shaky and jerky due to emulating the avatar's footsteps impacting the ground. More realistic, yes, but conventional wisdom would have this be a no-no, using the tiny fraction of the population who might get motion sick from this jerkiness as an excuse. The movement is slow and methodical, and seems to have a decent amount of acceleration from stop to start. Conventional wisdom would say this gets in the player's way, or would feel bad, unresponsive, not good to play. The avatar's aiming seems somewhat decoupled from where the camera is facing. Conventional wisdom would shun this yet again, saying it would be too disconcerting and unwieldy for players to deal with. Aim should always be around the center of the screen. Your weapon also appears to slightly jerk and tremble from those same character movements. Again, conventional wisdom might say this would be frustrating, and their visual aim should always be smooth and stable, and that other abstracted ways should be used to represent inaccuracy that doesn't visually disturb the player. And to justify all of these, conventional wisdom would cite the tiny vocal minority that always complains loudly and safely through anonymous text about anything that doesn't fit into their tiny box of rigid expectations. With all this in mind, you would expect an audience more critical of how Unrecord would play in practice. Concerns that it would be hard to see, difficult to focus, the aiming looks imprecise, the slow movement, and so on. Yet, they are not complaining. It is near universal praise and immense excitement for what they've seen, loving how realistic and detailed it all is, praising the very things that would apparently get in the way of their ability to click heads, with plenty even calling this the next step in gaming evolution. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention how the visuals, the phenomenal lighting in particular, are a big piece of the hype puzzle, and without them, excitement would not have spread as rapidly as it has, no doubt. but without all the other attention to detail supporting it in the sound, movement, animations, something would undoubtedly feel wrong. Those realistic visuals would seem less impactful if the avatar moved and behaved in traditional gamey ways, sliding around the place, gun locked in view. I believe the star of the show, which is making spectators so excited, is not the visual fidelity of the environment, but the detailed behavior of what's happening within it. I have a point I'll get to which relates to virtual reality. But before this, I'm going to need to highlight some of these details while ignoring the excellent visuals for now. Beginning with the avatar approaching a doorway, moving at a pace we would expect a real human to do, compared to how games typically have us at permanent jogging speed. We can notice the camera bobbing from left to right, simulating the effect his footsteps are having on the body cam. Note that it isn't generic movement bob either. It leans subtly from left to right, matching his steps. This crucial detail convincingly sells to us it could be a real person moving, and not a game character. Next, we see him check the magazine and charge around. Note the subtle physical behaviors that make this action so visceral and expressive. The movement of the hands and forearm as he adjusts pose. The physical force and reactions between hand and gun. Even more notably, the fact the entire action doesn't play out center screen like games usually always have them do. The initial checking of the magazine does, but the charging happens almost out of frame as the camera looks elsewhere, giving the impression this is a free-moving entity, rather than a game character with a weapon glued to the screen. You know, just like VR can do. Next, we see our character cautiously explore the building for a while, the movement appropriately slow and methodical with a sense of realistic acceleration and pace. The most notable highlight is the partial uncoupling of the weapon aiming from the camera. The gun is not static and glued to the coordinates on the screen. We see it shift around realistically, forward, backward, left, right, with more of the avatar's hands and arms becoming visible as it moves. The gun also slightly vibrates to the avatar's footsteps. Again, this all convincingly sells the fact that he is an entity freely moving through the world, and not someone sliding a mouse on a single plane of axis. You know, just like VR can do too. As he leans left to engage the combatant, note how his left forearm convincingly adjusts pose, and the wrists slightly angled too. This is followed by excellent gun-firing animation and its recoil affecting him, along with the visual effects. It all speaks for itself. Then see how the hand slightly adjusts itself on the weapon after the engagement, which also causes the weapon to slightly move too. Virtual reality could do this, but rarely ever does, with the physics-focused Bone series only displaying this behavior. Another magazine check, another great example of the physical force happening from his reinsertion of the magazine affecting both weapon and arms. We have nothing like this in virtual reality, sadly. Engaging another combatant, the physics of how the body crumbles to the floor is also an important detail. And the final detail I want to draw attention to, which I'll be using for comparison with VR soon, is related to weapon interaction once again. Specifically, a full reload. The free-form, visceral physicality in every action done during this process is what makes it so believable and compelling. The physical impact forces reacting on wrist, weapon, and arm all sell themselves as a completely dynamic behavior, and not a pre-canned animation. Your weapon not being glued to the front of the camera also helps here once again. It all looks outstanding and deeply satisfying in a way games have never done before. At least I haven't seen it before anyway. So those are the details I wanted to highlight, and it goes without saying that the visuals and sounds also do an amazing job, all of it coming together and complementing one another to get the result that has made so many spectators so excited and eager to participate. Now, as I said earlier, if we were to keep the visuals and sound, but replace all those details and animations with the traditional gamey stuff, gun glued to the center of the screen, generic camera effects, avatars sliding around the place, we would still be very impressed and excited, I'd guess. But would so many be heralding this trailer as the next step in gaming in the comment section as they are now? I'd wager not nearly as much. But if we were to swap the conditions, keep all the details of physical character animation and camera work with acceptable sound design, but put that in a much more visually simplistic environment that just does the job, would it ultimately be more compelling and interesting to watch by comparison? I'd wager yes. It certainly wouldn't generate as much immediate excitement as shiny visuals normally do, but I'd bet we would gravitate to and appreciate it more in the longer term because of all the soul contained in those details which keep us coming back. It's these oft-overlooked details combined that tantalize, excite, and compel us. We can more easily forgive the visuals being basic than we can the details being jank, lifeless, unconvincing. The dev team clearly understand this, put in the effort, and the public response is clear. Trusting them on their word, I can guess they must have put a lot of effort into making the movement and animations behave this way on keyboard and mouse. Which brings me, finally, onto how this all connects with virtual reality. For all of this effort that I assume must have gone into making mouse aiming look like VR aiming, which is one of the details praised from the Unrecord trailer, we can say, obviously, that VR shooters do this natively, as standard, and have the potential to go further for players and spectators. It's intrinsically part of the motion input. And yet, despite games existing right now which can show off a little of this same behavior, VR gameplay does not see the same interest or praise or excitement. It did a handful of years ago when the tech really started to explore more with freeform physicality, but things tapered off and died away as the software failed to develop further, and thus did general audience interest. Ignoring the visual fidelity for a moment, I hope the time I've taken so far to highlight the subtle details we saw in Unrecord can help us understand why, despite VR offering such potential gameplay behavior natively, we, 1. Never see this behavior from players, and 2. The general audience are not currently interested or compelled by what they see happening in VR as a spectator. Typical VR software is deathly lacking or completely devoid of these details which matter. And because VR has the kind of natural movement we saw as a native standard, the absence of those details make it even more disconnecting for player and observer alike. As a little comparison, let's remind ourselves of the reload animation in Unrecord. Wonderful, isn't it? All that realistic physicality displayed from each action. Mwah! Now let's focus on the satisfying force of charging the gun and how that plays out. So you would imagine that in VR, where, again, the primary input is itself the physical motion of your hands and arms, that it makes even more sense for this kind of detail to be there from the force of your movements as standard. You would think, right? Well, let's have a little look here. Contractors? Nope. Into the radius. Nope. All right. What about the premier gun simulator, hot dogs, horseshoes, and hand grenades? It has to. Nope. Ghosts of Tabor. Nope. Okay. If it's physical responses I'm looking for, then surely the most recent high-profile VR shooter that's all about the physics, Bone Lab, must have this to some degree. Nope. In fact, the only comparable VR game which I've played that does this to any extent like Unrecord is Boneworks. And it does so with only a fraction of the total detail we see in the trailer. But doesn't the handling look and feel that much more immediately engaging for it? And I know the other comparable shooters like Onward and Pavlov don't have this behavior either. So of all those, that's just one comparable VR game of so many, only showing a fraction of the detail we see in a flat-screen game that fools people into thinking it's a VR game because it contains the kind of detailed movement and behavior you would naturally expect to see in a VR shooter game. But yet, VR developers themselves never consider or add those details, even when their goal is realism and immersion. Bar a few rare exceptions, the care or understanding for the details just isn't there for VR developers so far. Maybe the developers believe these things don't matter, that the user doesn't care or notice, that there isn't interest or appreciation? Well, I hope the overwhelming praise, excitement, and millions upon millions of views from people eager to participate with this kind of detailed VR-like visceral behavior can prove to those devs otherwise. There is clearly a very hungry audience out there, and it's a damn shame VR still isn't stepping up to feed them when it so readily can. Unrecord looks to play how modern VR shooters can and should have been playing for many years already. The shaky cam effects understandably wouldn't occur when looking through the headset, but apply that effect and filter for the spectators on the monitor to make it more compelling for them, and there you go. And that's another thing VR devs need to come to terms with. The sharing and spreading word of your product through live streaming is a solidified reality of today's climate. Something many games can live or die based off of. VR games continue to fail dreadfully at this, most only offering a very limited, unfiltered, cropped view from one eye with no consideration for how it might be shared to attract spectators. Made even more unwatchable by things like snap turn, which is a gameplay compromising crutch VR games need to abolish in my opinion. Am I done yet? No. Another important factor that continues to hold back VR is how the developers are designing their games to ignore as much of the VR aspect as humanly possible. Despite all the capabilities of virtual reality, pay attention to how much the significant majority of VR games actually require you to do as a player. When you really start to pay attention, you'll notice most games are designed in a way that only ever needs you to hold out your hand just a little bit, with everything else having optional automation applied to it. Snap turn, teleport movement and grab, virtual crouch, janky, imprecise, poorly calibrated thumbstick movement. Bizarrely large hitbox concessions for interactions that completely negates the sensory advantage of already having true depth perception and a sense of presence. Almost never is there any requirement for us to engage with our bodies whatsoever in a typical VR title. And if we do use our bodies, we have to do so in spite of the game design. But here's the thing. The kind of gameplay behavior people have found so compelling from the trailer of Unrecord would occur in virtual reality right now, if we are required to be more directly engaged with our bodies and not allowed to lean on our training wheels all the time, disincentivizing us from engaging beyond the bare minimum. Plus, features like snap turn just look terrible to the observer. In multiplayer games, seeing characters snap direction in single frames, especially if immersion is a goal, it's just, it's awful. Devs, do you want to know why so many VR players still request features like teleport grab, even if it has no context within the game itself? It's because reaching around or changing stance to collect things or perform actions feels 10 times more cumbersome and annoying if you're standing around like a statue prior to that interaction. Our bodies aren't warmed up or in motion already, so it's that much more difficult to do. We humans, we are not cats or dogs. Our bodies operate from inertia. If we are encouraged to maintain consistent light movements more frequently in VR, even something as simple as I just mentioned, like moving our controllers and arms to affect our avatar movement, then I'm confident you'll see many of the grabbing complaints reduce significantly, and thus so would the need for the silly, lazy accessibility concessions. To be fair to developers though, it's not only their fault. Hardware limitations are also a factor in making us more static than we otherwise would be. The weight of the headset, and the tether in particular, the tether. I hate it so much. Other VR content creators have shared that Unrecord, despite being flat screen, will likely become playable in VR via a universal flat-to-VR Unreal Engine mod, and are pushing this as an exciting prospect to their user bases. I don't think this is a realistic or healthy thing to do, both for the audience or the industry. Flat-to-VR mods are impressive, and I have the utmost respect for what they achieve. But the reality is that they're only comfortably accessible to a tiny fraction of the VR community, who have extremely powerful, disgustingly overpriced, top-of-the-line hardware at their disposal. An elite club of privileged individuals, nowhere near the grasp of the average user. And even then, on top of the enormous performance costs of these mods, they come with all of the jank and limitations required to have them exist, and are still fundamentally bound to their flat-screen design principles. In the case of achieving Unrecord's visual fidelity with a high enough frame rate in VR, there would likely need to be some serious upscaling trickery combined with owning a NASA computer from 10 years in the future. I admire the mods and their makers, but I disagree with them being used as a selling point of excitement for virtual reality to the average consumer, at least in their current form. Build it, and they will come. Unrecord, if it's ever a real game, will no doubt require some hefty hardware to run even on flat screen, excluding many from participating initially. I promise you though, if it maintains all these details which have made it so compelling and gotten all this attention and excitement, then turns out to be the real deal, people will find a way to join in. Do not underestimate the power of this desire, particularly from the millions of nerds like you and me. If you're still not convinced, then I want you to imagine the trailer we've just examined, but this time imagine it with all of the current typical VR behaviors replacing what it has now. Imagine the avatar snap-turning through each scene. Near acceleration-less movement, completely smooth like he was sliding around on ice. Zero visceral physical force from interacting with his weapon. The magazine teleporting inside the magwell as he tries to reload. His hand teleporting to the gun from far away in a single frame to grip it. And arm movements that jerk, twist, and contort awkwardly. All these things VR games tarnish themselves with regularly. Imagine all those happening in this trailer now. How do you think the excitement from onlookers would be then? Alright, this script has bloomed far beyond my original intent, but I hope this video has left you with a wider perspective or at least something to think about when it comes to our attitudes and behavior toward VR design, how those attitudes are still holding it back to this day, and how this flat-screen game serves as proof of people's desire and hunger for the kind of details VR can offer natively, if developers stop designing their VR games to avoid VR behavior. Most of the grievances players have with the medium that you might concern yourself with as a developer are their own problems, not yours. Can you imagine car manufacturers willfully stifling their own production and advancement in design because a small subset of people get car sick and don't want to try to adapt? For the love of God, just stop with the concessions and go and make amazing, compelling VR experiences with no compromises or crutches holding it back. Build it, and they will come. An enormous thank you to all of the Patreons who have made the decision to support me. I ask for only £1 per creation. If you wish to support, links will be where they usually are.